Okay, so I think we're just a minute after the time. So we're going to get started with this webinar. Others might join us along the way. So again, all of you who are here, you are very welcome to this webinar. It's a Food Talks webinar where we're talking about food and different perspectives on food. And of course, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to food. And food is a great thing to talk over and share while we share ideas as well. Unfortunately, we can't serve you food here virtually, but we can serve food for the mind, we hope. If our panelists are good enough, which I believe they will be. So what we're really talking about today is the FSNet-Africa. It's the Food Security Network Africa. And I'm not going to say much about that because our speakers work on that and they're going to explain that. But it's a network dealing with food systems and food systems in Africa. So, and they're going to explain the network, they're going to explain the model the network's working with. And while we're understanding FSNet-Africa in the process, I think it also gives us a chance and it gives us a perspective on wider food system and food security challenges in Africa. So the model that they present and so on for FSNet-Africa, I think has got lessons in it for wider discussions on food system thinking as well. And then importantly, the thinking around the work of FSNet-Africa is also going to lead us into ideas around how we take sort of research into action, how research can inform debates, can inform policy, and hopefully inform sort of activities and outcomes as well that bring changes in people's lives. So look at this as learning about FSNet-Africa, but also the FSNet-Africa contributing to a debate around food systems more widely and around how we take research and knowledge into policy work and into action that can bring change in the real world out there as well. So I hope that, well, I think it's going to be exciting. I'm certainly interested to, learn more about FSNet-Africa. And I think these debates are increasingly important, and the challenges of meeting our food and nutrition security needs need us to be thinking in a more systemic approach. And we know that food system thinking has really sort of gained a lot of attention over the last couple of years. So I'm happy to be here. I'm looking forward to it. I should have said, I'm Mark Wegerif. I'm from University of Pretoria, where I coordinate the development studies program. And I'm very happy to be part of this webinar and organizing it and facilitating it. Let me briefly introduce our two panelists who are here. We're going to start out with Melody Mentz-Kotsia. And she's a senior research fellow at the Center for Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria. She got a PhD actually in psychology at the University of the Free State, So I think that brings an interesting perspective to food. And she plays a very important and leading role within FSNet-Africa at the moment, which she's been involved in from its inception. And then we have Dr. Njongenhle Nyoni, who's with FANRAPAN, the Food, Agriculture and Natural Resource Policy Analysis Network. I have to look at my notes to make sure I get that acronym right, FANRAPAN. So FANRAPAN is definitely a leading policy network on food in Africa. It's been going for some years now, and it's definitely a very important player in research and policy work on food security. So Melody and Njongenhle, you are very welcome. Thank you for joining us today and sharing with us. So we're going to get a presentation by the two of our panelists. It's going to be one presentation. Melody will start out and then Njongenhle will take over. And then we're going to take questions and maybe a bit of discussion, contributions, and so on as well. So you're very welcome, as I said before, to introduce yourselves in the chat. You can also put some questions and thoughts or contributions in the chat. And we're at about past. We're going to open the floor also for you to ask questions. And you will be able to raise your hand, contribute your question or your input directly, or use the chat again there. So please, I look forward to an active chat and then active engagement at about past after we finish with the presentation. So with that, it's not about me taking your time. So please, I would welcome Melody Mentz. You can, clap your hands, or if you know the reaction key anyway. Welcome, Melody, over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mark. And it is so exciting to see in the chat colleagues joining us from literally all over the world. Thank you so much for tuning in, and myself and Njo are really excited to talk to you today about the FSNet-Africa model. And as you can see on the title of my presentation, about building capacity for solving Africa's challenge using the FSNet-Africa model. So before I talk about the model, just very few introductory words about the Food Systems Research Network for Africa, or as we affectionately call it, FSNet-Africa. It's a research excellence project that is funded by the Global Challenges Research Foundation under the auspices of the partnership between UK Research and Innovation and the African Research Universities Alliance. There are three lead partners in FSNet-Africa. That is the University of Pretoria, the University of Leeds in the UK, and Van der Pan. Myself, I'm based at the University of Pretoria, and Njor, as you have heard, is representing Van der Pan here today. We also have a much broader network than the lead partners. So we have active collaborations with 10 African universities in 6 different countries. You can see them on the screen. And also within each of these countries, we're working with Van der Pan's multi-sectoral nodes to link our researchers to the society and to the structures and the policymakers outside of academia. So Njor will be telling you more about how we do that, but just to show you the current members in our network and where we're working. Really at the heart of FSNet-Africa is a 2-year structured research fellowship program. The program is targeted at early career researchers. The researchers can be working in any aspect of the food system, and they need to have obtained their PhDs in the past 10 years. So the focus of my component of the presentation today will be looking at how this fellowship model works, how we've structured it specifically, and the kind of impact that we're hoping to achieve through the model that we've put together. So before I show you the model, I think it's really important to make a few comments around why should we be focusing on early career researcher development? And specifically, why should we be focusing on this in the African context? And really, there's a very compelling case for why we should be doing so. Firstly, it is very well known that the global science enterprise has been rapidly expanding. This has been driven in part by the emergence of the knowledge economies and the increasingly important role that science, technology, and innovation has been playing in economic activity. At the same time, we've started to see increasing calls for science to make significant contributions to helping solve global sustainability challenges, such as those that are outlined in the SDGs or in other high-level agendas, such as Agenda 2063. As a result, we're seeing that the science enterprise is becoming increasingly competitive. And really, if we would like research and science to contribute to solving complex challenges, the type of research and the type of science that we do needs to increase in its complexity. So all of these factors together really have resulted in a situation where the demand for high-level skills in knowledge economies is increasing. It is also increasing in Africa, but in the African context, we found that countries have been lagging in their transition to knowledge economies. And so the demand for high-level skills in this context is arguably even more pressing than in the global context, the global north. And really, if Africa wants to be the driver of its own solutions to its own challenges, we need to be thinking about our research capacity for the future. But we need to be thinking not just about having more PhDs or having more researchers on the continent. We need to be thinking about the type of person and the type of researcher that we want to develop and grow. We need to think about researchers who can employ systems thinking and systems methodologies. We need people who can work across disciplinary boundaries, across geographic boundaries. We need people who can communicate their work effectively, who can engage stakeholders effectively, and who can connect their research and their science to actionable solutions. Now, for many reasons which we don't have time to explore today, this very diverse skill set cannot be fully developed during a PhD process. And for this reason, it is important that we have programs that really support our early career researchers to be able to develop these skills and to be able to be the kind of researchers that we need in the future. So if we look at the impact that we would like to achieve at FSNet-Africa, we're looking at three broad areas. The one is doing research that helps solve these grand challenges that we've been talking about. So in other words, undertaking research that's not only relevant, but is actionable and has impact. The second big area is around capacity generation, capacity building for the next generation of scientists. And then this question of networks. And you'll see that I've listed a whole different types of networks that we're trying to build through our model. So how our fellowship is designed is that it is a 2-year fellowship program, and we are using an integrated capacity building approach, where each of our fellows is actively doing a research project. They receive funding to do a research project. During their fellowship and while they're implementing their research, they participate in structured capacity building interventions. They work closely with a group of mentors, and there are very structured and very specific opportunities for networking and building long-term relationships. And so I'm going to be exploring exactly how we do this in a little more detail. All of our research, not surprisingly, since we're talking about food today, is centered around food systems. So we don't focus our research only on a specific aspect of the system, but our fellows are working on systems-based approaches and systems-based projects. In terms of the SDGs, really, I think the most well-known SDG around food systems is zero hunger. But when you look at it, all 17 of the SDGs can be mapped either directly or indirectly to the food system. Now, on the one hand, that's really exciting, but on the other hand, it really just demonstrates this notion of complexity that we were talking about, and being able to think in all these transdisciplinary and interconnected ways. So that's the research focus that our fellows have. Then, in terms of the approach, our integrated research capacity development approach, our capacity development interventions are timed specifically along the research cycle, so that fellows are participating in a particular intervention at the time when they need that for their research project. So we focus on 5 main skills types or skill sets: research project management, responsible research, research methods, how to achieve and think about research impact, and then research communication. We have 6 structured fellowship events during the 2-year fellowship, and each of these is mapped onto a particular point in the research lifecycle. So during orientation to the fellowship, we helped fellows to think through and conceptualize their research. We also gave them a broad introduction to the different topics that we'd be covering during the fellowship and the skills that they would need to master to do their projects. In later capacity development interventions, such as the 2 summer schools, we start to delve in greater depth into these topics, adding additional topics such as systems methodologies and research impact. Then towards the end of the project lifecycle, we start to focus on the questions of research communication. How does one communicate to different kinds of audiences, in particular policy audiences, and Joel will speak a lot more to this. And then finally, the fellowship concludes with a write shop, where fellows have the opportunity to sit down, have dedicated time to get their research into a publishable article format. So that's really a very quick overview of our topics, our skill sets, and the specific way that we've linked our design of the program to the skill sets that we're hoping to build. So how the fellowship is structured and how our research teams are structured plays a really important role in developing the skill sets of the fellows. So it's not only what we do in terms of training, but how our fellows work with their mentors and the University of Pretoria research community. So each research fellow is linked to 2 mentors. One is from an African institution within our partner network, and one is from the University of Leeds. Each fellow is also linked to a researcher at the University of Pretoria. The primary role of this researcher is to help the fellows to network within the university, to meet people who may have similar interests. But in the research team, if they would like to engage the UP host, as we call them, in the research project, they can do so. So you can see in this team, we're already helping to set up networks across different career phases, where early career researchers have access to senior mentors who can give them guidance. At the same time, we are helping to establish networks across the African continent between the research community. So our fellows are linked to mentors who are not in their own institution. And in this way, we're helping our young researchers get to know other researchers across the continent. And of course, through the links to the UK mentor, also to build their international networks. And the literature has clearly shown the benefits to young researchers of having strong and robust networks. And then finally, a very important feature of our research teams is that they transcend disciplinary boundaries. So because the project is focused on food systems, and because we want people to think outside of their discipline, fellows are matched with mentors who are not in the same discipline or department as them. And so each of our teams has between 3 and 5 different disciplinary areas of expertise. And in that way, the projects really can be thought of from an inter, multi, and transdisciplinary perspective. I'm now going to hand over to Njor, who's going to share with you more around how the stakeholder engagement components of the network works.
Thank you very much, Mel, for that background and for helping paint the picture in terms of our FSNet-Africa model. And thanks for the introduction, Mark. Jongen Fenyoni, the Capacity Strengthening Manager at FANAPAN, and I'm the Engagement Liaison Manager in the FSNet-Africa project. And focusing on stakeholder networks, we need to appreciate that stakeholder engagement is a defining feature of transdisciplinary research. While the focus on research that is relevant to development has gained traction broadly, the engagement of stakeholders as partners in the research process, as opposed to them being passive recipients of research results or communication, is not yet deeply entrenched in our ways of doing things, in our ways of delivering on our interventions or on research generally. So to truly achieve developmental impact through research, it is critical to embed stakeholders in the research life cycle. Here we need to think about when to engage the stakeholders. And this question, let's keep it in mind. When do stakeholders need to be engaged in the work that we are doing? And in the FSNet-Africa model, as Mel has highlighted, you may have seen that bit, is that from conception, conceptualization phase, through to the end, where the results are being presented, are being shared with the different stakeholders, stakeholders need to be embedded in the research. And this, you'll find that we are in the same page. We agree in principle that stakeholders need to be embedded, but the challenge usually lies in the practicality of engaging the stakeholders and operationalizing this aspect of engaging the stakeholders. And this is where boundary spanning organizations can play a very important role. In FSNet-Africa, one of the lead partners is highlighted is FANAPAN. And FANAPAN is essentially a network of networks of the ground stakeholders in the food system sector. And we have a well-established multi-sectoral node structure in place, multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder with different stakeholder groupings that are in place. And to connect our research in the FSNet-Africa project to these stakeholders, our teams engage directly with FANAPAN nodes in their respective countries. And through these nodes, they then are connected directly to the food system stakeholders. And once introduced to the stakeholders, the goal is to ensure that there's that continuous engagement with the stakeholders directly, and the process of engagement has to continue. There's the support from the node that continues, and there's that engagement with the stakeholders. So relationships are built with the stakeholders on the ground. And next, Mel. Thanks. We keep emphasizing the idea of ensuring that stakeholders are engaged and effectively so in the process. And in our FSNet-Africa model, we take seriously the idea of the aspect of stakeholders being engaged at all levels or throughout the life cycle of the research. And but to start off with, one has to understand who the stakeholders are, and stakeholders are those that have a stake in something, and that is those that have an interest in a particular project or system. So the interest groups, if you may call them, those that have a role to play in a particular project or intervention or systems, and they can be referred to as actors or role players. Those maybe just to summarize it and to highlight that stakeholders, those that are affected by a particular project or system, either positively or negatively. So these could be beneficiaries, target groups that you have with a project. So how are they affected by the project, whether positively or negatively? And we also think that when we engage the stakeholders, the engagement of the stakeholders is very key and important to position the research for impact beyond the academic sphere. The idea is not to have publications that are put in shelves and just influence other academic players, but the idea is to have impact on the ground within the FSNet-Africa project. And so our engagement with stakeholders positions our research beyond just the academic space. So it allows us also to build those lasting collaborative research relationships with the food systems stakeholders. And then the interventions that we come up with, the results and the interventions are scaled out because of the participation of the broader players beyond just academia, and they are scaled out, scaled deep, and scaled up. And to identify who stakeholders are, we do the stakeholder mapping exercise where we identify the key stakeholders, and there's a process of identifying key stakeholders through literature review, engaging with experts in the sector, as well as brainstorming with focal persons. And in our case, it has been the FANAPA nodes that have been instrumental in linking the researchers with the food system stakeholders on the ground. And this exercise of stakeholder mapping helps to identify stakeholders and categorize them in terms of their influence and the interest, their interest. And you see in in defining the interest, you've got to understand that the interest of the stakeholders is the focus on the project or action. What are they? What is the focus there? Are they their interest in the output of the intervention of the project? And then the influence focuses mostly on the power. Who has the power to influence what is happening within what is happening with our intervention? Some people have power to decide what happens, and we need to think about who those players are as we are mapping our stakeholders. And the effective part of stakeholder engagement has to, we need to have a plan of action, and we have these stakeholder engagement plans that the fellows have developed. And these stakeholder engagement plans help to highlight who the key stakeholders are, the interest influence groups there, categorizing the different stakeholders, their roles, their responsibilities, how to engage with them, and the communication part, which is very critical when engaging with a diverse set of stakeholders, how to manage the expectations of the different stakeholders, and keeping the stakeholders engaged throughout the course of the research project. And then the metrics now, we need to, so that is just highlighting the interest influence metrics, where how to engage with the different stakeholders with the 4 quadrants, those that have the highest influence, the highest interest, how we work with those people or with those stakeholder groupings, and thinking about others as well: low interest, high influence, low influence, high interest stakeholder groupings. And yeah, we could unpack that maybe some other time. But think then coming towards the end and just repeating or reiterating the process of engaging with different stakeholders, the question that has to stay in mind and that we have to keep answering is when we should engage with key stakeholders. And yes, at dissemination, yes, of course, we need to engage stakeholders with dissemination. And this is where we were highlighting with, where Mel was highlighting that they are those platforms that we have within our program project, where we will be engaging with different stakeholders, including policymakers, decision makers, to ensure that research feeds into policy development processes. But it doesn't start there. It has to start at conceptualization of the intervention. Stakeholders have to inform the research agenda. We have to also, it doesn't stop there, implementation, project proposal implementation, and we have been engaging with stakeholders proposal level as well, and implementation already engaging with different stakeholders. So those are very important and critical phases where all across the research life cycle, where stakeholders need to be effectively engaged. And we believe that the FSNet model can be applied by others for several purposes and in many different ways. And we believe that it can be applied to many complex developmental challenges and adapted for joint PhD program in early career researchers with a slight different focus, but the model could be or could work with both. And here are some elements that we could consider in terms of the FSNet-Africa project. We are primarily focused on food systems, but other programs can, and the model can be transferable and applied in any wicked or complex challenge. We're focusing on post-PhD focus. We have a post-PhD focus, but any early career stage could be an interest or focus area. We've got our core elements there that are highlighted, which is multi-mentor model, integrated research project, capacity development, and capacity development there focus on research and complementarity, the focus on communication with and beyond the academia. And we believe that those core elements are critical as well in any intervention or project that can be implemented. Then we've got also the final part, we're looking at early and continued engagement with stakeholders, and that should be a way to go in terms of a new approach in implementing our research. This will take investments. This will require us to really think through this. It requires that we have resources in terms of time, finances. The process will demand. It will be taxing to an extent, but it is worth it so that we position our research for impact. Mel? Thank you.
Thanks, Njo.
Thanks, Njonge and Claire. Thank you very much. And thank you, Melody. Welcome back. So thanks very much for the input. We're going to take any questions which people can ask and also put in the chat. I want to just remind us or state that this event, the food talks and other webinars like this we've done in the past and we'll do in the future, are organized, of course, by FSNet-Africa. And along with also the DSI NRF Center of Excellence in Food Security, and also the Development Studies Program at University of Pretoria. So with that sort of team organizing these events, and you will hear about more in the future, I hope, and attend them. So thanks very much for that. I also should have mentioned that Njongentle got his PhD at WITS in Geography and Environmental Sciences. So there we get, we already see the trans or interdisciplinarity of psychology to environmental sciences in our panelists. And what we heard in the presentation involved a lot of sort of transdisciplinary ways of working. I'm kind of, one question in my mind is, you know, how is that working out? You know, there can be disadvantages for students in, you know, in the siloed world of academia, sometimes in a transdisciplinary approach, and difficulties in adapting. Maybe you could tell us how that's working out.
I'm muted. I'm back. Yeah, I'm willing to take a first stab at that, and then Njo can also add, I think, Mark. I don't think it's only challenging for early career researchers to work in transdisciplinary ways. I think it's even challenging for established researchers to do it. And I think the thing we need to try to strike a balance between is what are the mechanisms that can be in place to ensure that there is adequate depth in a particular discipline or methodology, and at the same time set up those conditions that help you work across disciplines? And I think also there is a lot of misunderstanding about multi-inter and transdisciplinary approaches and what each of those actually are. But that's another topic for another day. I think, yeah, it's part of that is that balance. And it's something that you have to keep your finger on the pulse. So one of the things we do at FSNet-Africa is we regularly try and keep in touch with our teams to see how things are going. And some of the transdisciplinary approaches come in the mentorship. Sometimes it needs to come with a formal capacity development. So if you're keeping in touch with people on the program, you can pick up sometimes, we need extra skills here, or we need an extra intervention there. I think it's not just here's a formula that makes it work. It's something you have to keep working on. I don't know, Joy, if you want to add something to that, and even you, Mark, your experience.
So I think, Mel, you've done justice to answering that question. And I'm currently in the USA. We drive on the other side of the road. In South Africa, you drive on the left, the USA drives on the right. So you've got to be present and apply yourself to make sure that you keep to the right. Otherwise, you go back to your traditional ways of doing things. And I think what Mel is explaining is very critical, that we need to apply ourselves and work it out so that we have the aspects that we want to achieve at the end of the day. The impact that we want to realize, it will take us to have to apply ourselves and to have that effort, build the capacity, look at the gaps and the opportunities, and have a system that works and responds to the needs of the beneficiary at the end of the day.
Great. Okay, thank you. So I see a few questions from Mabel, which are really about the eligibility criteria. And you're talking about early research or early career researchers. So maybe you could just define a bit more clearly the category of people you're referring to. What is this early career researcher that you are involving, and what's the eligibility criteria? I think those are related questions.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's actually a really, really good question. There are very few accepted or general definitions of the early career research phase. In another project, we've actually done an in-depth literature review trying to look at this. Essentially, the definition that we accept is you're an early career researcher from the point when you start working on a master's and until the point where you are an independent researcher and can win your own research grants, supervise your own students, and essentially function without supervision. That includes, of course, now then the PhD phase and the post-PhD phase. And the reason I give this long explanation of the definition, because it's a very important definition in the African context, where many of our institutions, researchers have a master's degree and are aspiring to a PhD. So to restrict the definition of an early career researcher only to those with a PhD in the African context is limiting. And so we adopt this more of a spectrum definition. Specifically for FSNet-Africa, eligibility for the program was set at you had to have a PhD. So we're a specific type of program along the early career researcher spectrum. You needed to have a PhD, you needed to have an employment contract at one of our partner institutions, and then we had a rigorous application and selection process. So we currently have our 20 fellows and don't have we're not taking additional applications unless we get another cohort. But that was the criteria for eligibility in the current cohort.
So maybe you could just clarify when this started. I mean, because I think you are in the
Yes.
first phase. I should also admit that I'm one of the UP hosts as well, so I'm somewhat involved a little bit. But maybe you can clarify that. And then when did you start? Because I'm also interested in the cycle and then what we're learning out of that cycle. And then I see Zablon with your hand up. I'll come to you just now. And maybe our panelists can look in the chat. I don't want to read the whole of Michelle's question. Maybe you can read it and then can respond on those as well. And Mobile was also backing that question. There's interest in applying for this, so I think people want that clarity on exactly who can get involved and how.
Yeah, so I mean, we started our first cohort of fellows, started the program in July of last year, of 2021. We, as was everybody around the globe, delayed to some extent because of COVID. So our current fellows are pretty much a year into the program. If we have our way, we will definitely be having another cohort of fellows who would hopefully that could even be as early as 2023. So I think for those who would in the future be interested in something like this, we do have a contacts database and a mailing list. If you pop your contact details in the chat, we can add you to that. And as we have other opportunities or are aware of opportunities, can loop you into those communications. Great.
Within that, have you responded on the master's question? And the question also in Jongenhle was about the best way to contact potential stakeholders at the conceptualization phase.
George, do you want to take the stakeholder question? Yeah, I do. Do you see it, George?
Yeah, so for stakeholders, there's a lot of work that has to be done, groundwork that has to be done by the researcher themselves to establish who the stakeholders are. So as I highlighted, those that have a stake in the project, those that are affected or can affect the outcomes of the project. So you've got to know or to think about who those people would be. And that process will entail you going through your literature review. Literature will highlight that, the reports in the peer-reviewed material, but also some materials from other organizations, civil society organizations that are in place in a particular area. You can find that online, but that may not be exhaustive. You can also, as I highlighted, engage with aspects in the field. So based on your particular field of interest, you will have those aspects that you have to know in the space. You can do a bit of literature search. You can talk to your supervisor to advise who those aspects are, and then you get a bit more information leading to before you start with the actual engagement at conception. Then you've got also the brainstorming. In our case, we have the FANAPAN nodes with the FANAPAN platform, where those stakeholder, the nodes link us with the stakeholders on the ground. So that background is very important because then you will know who the stakeholders are, and as you're coming up with your stakeholder engagement plan, you know how to communicate with stakeholders. Some stakeholders, it may be you may have to have someone else helping you with contacting them. So you don't have to contact all stakeholders directly yourself. It could be your supervisor, it could be some partner that you've identified. If it's a FANAPAN linked stakeholder, you could ask FANAPAN to help you reach out to the stakeholder and then build that relationship yourself. And so the initial convening, you can have support from FANAPAN, for example, in our case, convening the different stakeholders, inviting them for a platform. Then you come as a researcher, engage with the stakeholders, build that relationship, and be able to then continue to relate with the stakeholders beyond just the conception phase. I hope that helps.
Thanks.
Yeah. Can I add something to that, Mark? I think to what Njo's been saying, which highlights for me why the partnership between FANAPAN and UP Leads was such an important one for FSNet-Africa. Because, you know, in the academic space, academics don't always have the skills or even the inclination sometimes, or the networks, to know who the critical stakeholders are. They don't have those relationships necessarily, whereas an organization such as FSNet-Africa does. And so this brings that point of the boundary spanning organizations and the partnerships between them. As researchers, I mean, we need to at least have an idea of how things work, but you don't have to do everything yourself. It's about those partnerships, I think, that also make true transdisciplinary research work really well. So I just wanted to add that and draw why this kind of partnership was good for FSNet-Africa.
Thank you. So I'm bringing in Zablon Owiti. I hope I'm saying that right. So you're welcome, and you can put your question. Maybe just tell us where you're from as well. And
yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah, I'm Zablon Owiti, and I think I met Neoni a few days ago. I'm a climate expert from African Capacity Building Foundation. Yeah, so mine is just a clarification when to Melody in terms of you did indicate that the early career researchers you engage with stakeholders, but I wanted to find out if they are also or you plan to embed them within what I may call user institutions, like policy institutions that the challenges that they are trying to probably address will be used by these institutions, so that they, and of course this one also reinforces the multidisciplinary part of it, so that they really co-develop or co-explore the solutions, and this gives the ECRs opportunities to really appreciate the challenges from the user's perspective. Thank you.
thanks, Zablon. Any response there?
Yeah, I'll make a comment, but I think Njor can also make a couple of comments specifically around the policy side. So not all of our fellows are doing necessarily policy-focused work, although many are. And in the cases where they are doing policy work, part of the process with FSNet-Africa has been this one of trying to identify who the stakeholders are. And, Njor, you can maybe speak to some of the other things we're going to do around policy. I don't think we could go as far as to say they're fully embedded in these kind of organizations where they have grappled very deeply with the organization and the policy, or the policy side of it and the challenges that it brings, but definitely connected to them would be my sense. And Joel, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Mel. The idea is to ensure that research is relevant and is taken up and informs policy processes or decisions. We generate evidence that can be used practically and provides the solutions on the ground. So that really will require that we engage with the different stakeholders. But as we're saying, as Mel highlighted, that it doesn't have to be all the work by the early career researchers in terms of getting all the transformation happening, but it's having those relationships and having channels in which the research outputs can then be taken. And when stakeholders have been included or involved in the conception, they have an appreciation of what the idea, the research intervention is, they've shared their input. You are now generating evidence that is relevant and can be used by the different beneficiaries, whether it's a state actor or non-state actors. So the approach really is about ensuring that there's the linkages are there, and we've plans to have these policy dialogues, engaging at high level with different policy actors at national level as well as continental level, because the Food Systems Africa Network for Africa. So we're already looking at those opportunities and where our research is feeding into the policy space or the decision making in terms of improving our agriculture and food systems in the continent. And so we create that platform where we have that engagement as well, share these the findings and establish these relationships going forward beyond just the first, I'll call it maybe the first phase of our intervention as FSNet-Africa. We will hope that we will have those relationships beyond just this part of our project. Thanks.
So it seems you do really want to have real world change out there in terms of food systems and how they operate and who they benefit. I'm just sort of wondering then how you overcome the power dynamics or engage with those that you mentioned, John Gentley. So beyond that, I mean, yes, we want relevant research, but we know good research isn't always listened to because there are other considerations that decision makers have. And I'm also thinking that, I mean, this is the first batch, so I suppose this is experimental as well. So I'm kind of interested in how you're going to continue to track and monitor that, that impact out there. I know, Melody, you've worked for many years on monitoring and evaluation, so I'm sure you're thinking about that. But yeah, beyond your 2 years of the fellows, the change you're talking about in John Gentley would go beyond that. How are you going to support and track that?
Yeah, so I mean, so Mel maybe on M&E would be very helpful in terms of painting that picture. FNAPAN has been in the policy space for a while, and so it's one of the critical parts, and we keep emphasizing the critical parts of this model is ensuring that the solutions that we are coming up with are not coming from us as the researchers or the research community. So the solutions that the evidence that is generated, we are responding to the needs of the beneficiaries. So the core development part allows for, it positions us for uptake of the evidence that is being generated within the project. So there is the issues of power dynamics. There's aspects of negotiating as well in the space of when evidence is being presented, not to negotiate the quality of evidence, but the engagement with the different stakeholders and what the needs of the different stakeholders may be when conceptualizing the idea in terms of focusing. But we are not veering or moving away from the scientific rigor and generating evidence that is rigorous enough to be solid and but the way, the approach that we have in terms of negotiations, engagements, conception, proposal development with the different stakeholders, it helps in terms of allowing for that uptake in terms of evidence when it is being generated. But yes, the parts of monitoring beyond this is very critical, and we need to invest in that as well. We have monitored some, we have followed up on some beyond the implementation of certain projects that we've had, but there's more work that needs to be done to ensure that good research feeds into decision making in terms of policy development processes. Mel,
thanks. Yeah.
Yeah,
something to add. I mean, so we will certainly be doing monitoring and evaluation beyond the fellowship period for at least a 5-year period afterwards to understand, and I'm going to use this term very broadly now, the impacts. And Joe has spoken to some of those, the way that the research can possibly influence policy or practice. From the angle of the topic of our conversation today, what is also important for me is, yes, it's a particular kind of research that can make a difference. But 5, 10, 15 years down the line, one of the big impacts for me of FSNet-Africa is we have a cohort of researchers who, for the rest of their lives, do things differently, who've been exposed to this way of doing research, of thinking about problems and challenges, and who go on then to continue to grow in that and mature. I mean, as researchers, we'd all love the one thing we do to literally change the world, but realistically, it often doesn't. but we do grow in the way that we do things. And so for me, there's a big scope there for future impact as well, in people who continuously approach their work and their research in different ways that can contribute to very important changes in the food system.
And just to add from my side that I don't think there's an assumption that the fellows are going to remain in academia all their lives. So I think in terms of Zablon's question also, I mean, the chances are, or the hope I think would be that quite a number of them would end up in those key decision-making positions at national level and in certain international spaces and so on. So, you know, as Melody's saying, if they're equipped to operate in an effective way to deal with the real challenges in our food systems, the real challenges of food and nutrition security, then we hope that they will take that into many spaces and influential spaces, and this will help equip them for that. So, Are there other questions? I am looking at the chat. I am looking out for hands if they're there. I do think from the interest some people have in the program, I would ask on their behalf if you have an idea sort of when you might know about the next round. When should they be looking out for the calls for applications for the next round of fellowships? And all the partnerships that come with that, with the UK and other places and universities across Africa.
Yeah, so we unfortunately don't have anything we can commit to in terms of timelines yet. But as soon as there is, we will communicate also on our social media. Liz has put our Twitter handle there, so please do follow us on Twitter. And when there is exciting news, we will share it. Okay,
great. And I wanted to say also, well done on getting a commitment to evaluation 5 years later. That rarely happens, you know. And of course, we know that impact from any program, development program, and any capacity building program will not really be seen. Certainly, will rarely be seen immediately. Even 5 years can be a short time. But to get a commitment to assessing impact 5 years later is great and gives some chance of seeing the real impact. So, in these closing minutes, I would just like to turn back to Melody and Njongenhle. To see if you have any closing words you'd like to share from each of you.
And Joe, do you want to start? I started the presentation. You can.
So
not always ladies first.
Yeah, no, it's all right, Mel. Thanks. I think for me, I think it's clear that we need to do things differently, as Mel was highlighting. We need to change the traditional ways of doing research and practically find ways of engaging with stakeholders, the key stakeholders, to ensure that we position our research for impact, even if it's not policy change as mentioned, but ensuring that the beneficiaries are able to use the evidence that we have generated as from the academic space. I keep saying we, although I'm representing Fanapan, because I'm also a researcher in a way. So there's that evidence generation that stays on the shelves. It should not stay on the shelf. We have to, the resources that we generate, we invest in this have to be meaningful. And that for us, setting ourselves up for impact involves engaging stakeholders throughout the research value chain. So I think that's very critical for us to take as a take-home message. Thanks, Mark. Mel.
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, so I think concluding thoughts from my side, Mark, really would be thank you for the opportunity to talk today. It's really been great for me. It's a really exciting topic for me to talk about capacity building around research, and specifically around research that can make a positive contribution in society. So thanks for everyone that joined us in this conversation, and we look forward to the opportunity to engage with you in the future again.
Yeah, great. So from my side, thank you, Dr. Melody Mens, Dr. Njongenhle Nyoni. Thank you very much for your time and for sharing. Thanks to all the attendees who joined and for the organizers behind the scenes, you know, so FSNet-Africa. thanks for the initiative. It's a challenging initiative. You're trying to take on many issues that we struggle with, to be truly transdisciplinary, to link our research to real action. These are things we're all striving for. And I think this is an interesting and exciting experiment in doing that we should all be watching. So good luck with it. And thanks again to everyone for joining.
Thanks, Mark.
Ciao.
Bye.